Well, the last 24 hours have been packed with news, both news in Ukraine and also further east in the looming confrontation between the United States and China, which could easily overshadow the events in Ukraine unless it is handled carefully, of which there is no sign at the moment, by the way. But before I proceed with that, I want to just clarify one particular point and address one specific issue which has come from a point made to me in an email by Joe Laurier, who is the editor-in-chief of Consortium News. Now, specifically, over the last 24 hours, the Russian authorities have been warning that if there are Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory, they reserve the right to start attacking Ukrainian decision centers. And I discussed in my program yesterday, and also in programs that I've done with Alex Christoforou on the Duran, one specifically, what the meaning of decision centers is. It means, in my opinion, I've no doubt, that it specifically refers to Ukraine's political leadership. Now, I'd assumed that the Russian Defense Ministry, which had issued the warning, was referring to the pinprick attacks that the Ukrainians have been engaging in various villages and settlements in Russia on the other side of the border with Ukraine. These are places not far from the border. Ukraine has been sending sabotage groups and helicopters to carry out strikes on, well, one specifically on a village about a week ago, on an oil facility near Belgorod, that kind of thing. Joe Laurier has pointed out that, in fact, what almost certainly provoked this statement from the Russian Defense Ministry is information that the United States is now sharing with Ukraine, intelligence information that the United States is collecting, not just about the situation in Ukraine itself, but also about the situation in Crimea, though not elsewhere in Russia. And that does seem to signal that the United States, or might signal that the United States might be willing to facilitate Ukrainian attacks on Crimea, which of course Ukraine still claims as part of its own territory. Now, this would be a massive escalation, at least would be so construed by the Russians, and almost certainly, in fact, I am absolutely no doubt about it, the Russian Ministry of Defense statement was intended as a warning to the Ukrainians that if they do try any kind of attack on Crimea, to the extent, obviously, that Ukraine is in a position to carry out such an attack, then it must expect an overwhelming response from Russia, far beyond anything we've seen up to now. All restraints will, in that case, well and truly be off, and the Russians will indeed go after the Ukrainian political leadership. I would say that this comment, this disclosure that the United States is providing intelligence information to Ukraine about Crimea is incredibly reckless. I doubt actually that it is intended to facilitate a Ukrainian attack on Crimea. I think more plausibly it's another sign of the difficulties that the United States finds itself in through its continued pretense that, or if you like, observation of the fiction that Crimea, which is now fully integrated in Russia and considers itself to be a part of Russia, that the Crimea is still a part of Ukraine. So I think it was a legalistic step rather than an active military one, though of course sharing information about intelligence information about what is going on in Crimea may also to some extent assist Ukraine in conducting its defences, given how important Crimea is as a logistical base for the Russians in their continued operation in Ukraine itself. I would add, by the way, that I think it is all but inconceivable that the United States is not also providing Ukraine with information about Russian troop concentrations in Russia itself, Russia proper, if you like. But I'm going to leave that discussion for another day. Anyway, I wanted to make that clear because that's, I think, an important issue. The other matter that I must readdress is the question of what's happened to the Moskva. Yesterday, the Russians provided information that the Moskva had been damaged by what they claimed was an internal fire, which had caused some of the ammunition to explode, and that this had led to the crew of the Moskva being evacuated, and that the ship, which had retained buoyancy, was being taken to a base for repair, presumably Crimea. The Ukrainians, in the meantime, had made various claims that they'd attacked Moskva with anti-ship missiles. I've expressed skepticism about that last claim because it seems that the Pentagon is unable to confirm the Ukrainian claim, or at least is not doing so. And I can't help but think that if there had really been an anti-ship missile strike on Moskva, the US, which is certainly monitoring the movements of the Russian Black Sea Fleet very carefully, would certainly be aware of the fact. So I still tend to discount the claim that this was an anti-ship missile strike, though I'm not going to pretend that I know clearly one way or the other. Regardless, a few hours later, after the Russians made that announcement, they also announced that Moskva, whilst being towed, presumably to Crimea, had sunk in stormy seas. There's a problem with this claim, which is that if you actually look at the meteorological data, the seas in that part of the Black Sea were not at that particular point especially stormy. So that has, of course, triggered a whole lot of speculations as to what exactly has happened to Moskva, or what happened to Moskva. I want to reiterate that what exactly caused the initial damage to Moskva is not really clarified by this further incident about the ship sinking, this further episode of the ship sinking. I'm going to just venture my own guess, and I want to repeat, this is just a guess. I think the Russians decided to scuttle the ship. I think that the Russians took it further away from the Ukrainian coast so as to prevent combat divers from Ukraine or Americans or anybody like that having an opportunity to investigate and find out more about it. And I think they would have taken it further away from the Ukrainian coast, taken away any valuable equipment that might be of a compromising nature, such as computers and logbooks and that sort of thing, and that they then decided to scuttle the ship. And I think the reason they did that was because whether or not the ship was retrievable, even if it had been retrievable, given that the ship is going to be struck off anyway, it is 40 years old, and as I said, its replacement as the Black Sea Fleet's flagship is already in the process of construction. Given that this is so, it made absolutely no sense to bring it to Crimea or elsewhere on Russia's Black Sea coast, take up valuable space in shipyards, of which, by the way, Russia is not particularly abundantly provided with in the Black Sea. The historic main shipyard of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea is in Nikolaev, which is, of course, now part of Ukraine, and which is a contested city. So rather than leave this ship in a shipyard taking up valuable space until it was broken up. I think the Russians simply ferried it somewhere and then let it sink, getting obviously a sad end to, in some ways, a beautiful ship, but one which I think seems to me the simplest explanation for what has happened to the ship itself. So, turning from that, we are now, it seems to me, in a situation where we can turn to what is the more important events, which are actually happening on the ground in Ukraine itself. I say that because sad, though the loss of a ship always is, I always find it sad, whichever side it's on. Ships are beautiful things. We should not, I think, place too much emphasis on this particular incident. Now, the most important events remain on the ground, and the Russian Defense Ministry provided a most interesting briefing about the state of the military operation events in terms of the military operation in Ukraine over the last 24 hours. Now, I should say that Russian Ministry of Defense briefings are generally unbelievably vague and uninformative. They provide very little information about what is actually going on the ground. They basically a recitation of missile strikes on various parts of Ukraine. Very occasionally they provide information about advances here and there, but usually they are, as I said, just a recitation of information about missile strikes. And in addition, I would also say that they provide a running countdown of the amount of weaponry, Ukrainian weaponry, that the Russians claim to have destroyed. Well, this latest briefing was different. And first of all, it confirms information that I had yesterday, which is that the Ilyich steelworks in Mariupol has now been completely cleared of Ukrainian troops. And this comes shortly after confirmation that the port in Mariupol has also been cleared of Ukrainian troops also. That leaves the Azovstal steelworks as the last bastion of Ukrainian defense in Mariupol. Well, that was something, of course, that I knew yesterday. The briefing then says that the Russians launched a missile strike on a machine building plant in near Kiev, which was involved in workshops for providing production repair workshops for long and medium-range anti-aircraft missile systems, as well as anti-ship missiles. Well, that might, of course, refer, if there was a missile strike on Moscow, that might have been in retaliation, but who knows. But then we have this warning. The number and scale of missile strikes against assets in Kiev will increase in response to any terrorist attacks or sabotage on Russian territory by the Kiev nationalist regime. So in effect, the Russians are saying, look, if you continue launching little pinpoint strikes on Russian territory, we will intensify our long-range missile strikes against Kiev. This is clearly distinct from the strikes against the decision centres. And here I agree with Joe Laurier that the strikes against the decision centres specifically is a specific warning against any attack on Ukrainian attack on Crimea. Well, that is interesting in itself, that the Russians have up to now held back from launching missile strikes on Kiev. This has been, by the way, fairly obvious for a long time, in fact from the start of the fighting, but that if Ukraine continues missile and sabotage attacks, or airstrikes rather, and sabotage attacks on Russian territory, then the Russians will intensify strikes on Kiev itself. Then, after that report, came one of the more interesting ones, the one that was I found particularly interesting, because then we read Russian air defense means near Gorodnaya, Chernigov region have shot down one Ukrainian Mil-8 helicopter with S-400 anti-aircraft missile system whilst it was returning to its airbase after attacking civilians in Klimovo, Bryansk region on April 14th. Right, now I should say first of all that this is, as far as I'm aware, the first recorded use of the S-400 anti-aircraft missile system in combat. And the Russians say that, or make it clear that they were able to track the 2 Ukrainian helicopters that carried out that airstrike on Bryansk, and that the S-400 shot down one of these 2 helicopters whilst it was returning to its base near Gorodnaya in Chernigov region. At least this is how I understand this particular sentence. And that is a very interesting development. Now, the S-400 would have been used obviously from Russian territory. We don't know from where. It's supposed to have a range of 400 kilometers. That would suggest that it was operating from somewhere in North or Central Russia, or rather in Central Russia, rather than, say, Crimea. But anyway, it's basically a warning to Ukrainians that even if you've returned, you think you're over your own territory, after you've launched one of these strikes on Russian territory, we can still track you, we can still shoot you down. We don't need our aircraft to do it. We can track you and shoot you down with our S-400 systems, which have wide sweep over Ukrainian territory as well. So that's in itself quite a big event. But then it gets even more interesting, because after the usual recitation of Ukrainian formations that have been attacked and destroyed, claims that one Ukrainian formation was destroyed with a loss of up to 20 armored vehicles and 50 what the Russians call nationalists, and that this involved a Tochka-U tactical missile strike. Anyway, after that sort of thing, we then read that missile troops have eliminated a mercenary unit of a Polish private military campaign in Iziumskoye, Kharkiv region. Up to 30 Polish mercenaries were killed. Well, that's a rather extraordinary statement. I mean, it's known that there are Polish volunteers fighting in Ukraine. It seems the Russians claim that they have destroyed a unit of these. They're careful to say that it was a private military campaign. It was a mercenary unit, so this isn't clearly a Polish army unit that was deployed in Ukraine. But up to 30 Poles have been killed in a missile strike. And note that this has happened near Izium in Kharkiv region, which is where the Russians are organizing their main build-up of their northern thrust that is closing on the Ukrainian forces in Donbass, in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So this is obviously quite a potent strike, and it does make one wonder quite what it means. But then we start to get even more, and we have from the Russians all sorts of other claims about various Ukrainian forces that were destroyed in various places in and around Ukraine. So some really quite fascinating revelations here. Firstly, confirmation that the Ilyich factory area is now under Russian control in Mariupol, leaving only Azovstal still standing. Confirmation, or at least a claim, that a Ukrainian helicopter that was involved in an airstrike on Russian territory was shot down by an S-400 missile system, Russian S-400 missile system, whilst over Ukrainian territory, this being the first occasion of Russia's use of this particular missile system. And thirdly, this really quite remarkable claim that a Polish unit, a volunteer unit, the Russians call it a mercenary unit, with up to 30 Polish fighters, was destroyed by Russian missile strike near the Donbass front lines, near Izium in Kharkiv region. So quite a powerful briefing, and of course all of it capped with the further warning that if Ukraine launches more pinpoint strikes against Russia, the Russians will intensify their missile strikes on Kiev and the Kiev region. So, an interesting briefing, and I would say that it's supplemented with all the usual information that I'm getting from the ground about the situation in and around Donbass. And I'm not going to go over this in huge amount of detail, but it does seem as if more Ukraine, more territory in Donbass. The Russians are steadily continuing their various advances and in and around the major Ukrainian force in Donbass. And by the way, I saw a rather interesting interview. Well, it wasn't a particularly interesting interview, but it was a rather usual interview with Zelensky on, I believe it was Sky News, a rather confusing interview. But over the course of it, he appeared to confirm that 44,000 Ukrainian troops were in danger of encirclement in Donbass, that the Russians were trying to encircle these troops. I suspect these are, in fact, essentially encircled, and that these are the troops that we know about in Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, and Zelensky has given a number for them, which is 44,000. So there we go. Now, that, it seems to me, is the major information from the battlefronts in Ukraine. I've also read a rather scathing briefing in a US magazine, a veterans magazine, about the quality of the military supplies that the United States is giving to Ukraine. Now, I'm not a military person, and I did speak yesterday, in my video yesterday, that it did look rather less impressive than what had been led to expect. There was no sign of the surface-to-surface missiles that people had been talking about. Anyway, this veterans magazine claims that the weapon systems that have been provided, the 11 Mi-17 helicopters, the 100 M113 armoured vehicles, were originally intended for the Afghan army. And that presumably also includes the 18 howitzers. And that this is what is essentially happening is that Ukraine is being palmed off with weapon systems, obsolete weapon systems, originally intended for the Afghan army and paid for through the seizure of the reserves in the Afghan central bank. Now, I've already said that the helicopters, these 11 helicopters, really are not going to make any difference given the scale of losses of Ukrainian helicopters in Ukraine. And I've also pointed out that 18 howitzers is not going to make any significant difference given the vast amount of damage that's been done to the Ukrainian armed forces. I'm now seeing more and more film, by the way, of Ukrainian troops moving around Ukraine in civilian vehicles, which of course puts them in extreme danger. By the way, it also puts civilians driving in their own civilian vehicles in danger as well. One wonders how the Russians would know which civilian vehicles are carrying Ukrainian soldiers and which are carrying actual Ukrainian civilians. But anyway, that's a matter for discussion for another day. I'm not going to go there. But the underlying point is the cynical nature of this whole exercise, because the United States is talking all the time about supporting Ukraine, but it's clear that so far, despite claims to the contrary, the United States is not prepared to provide the kind of equipment, heavy equipment, that it's been talked about. And by the way, this is becoming increasingly true in Europe as well. The East European states that were once members of the Warsaw Pact have been passing off their old Soviet-era hardware to Ukraine. Much of it is very outdated. Greece has now refused to provide more of its equipment to Ukraine, even including some Soviet-era equipment that it bought, some of it from Germany after the reunification of Germany. And other countries like Spain are refusing to provide any significant military equipment as well, and so is Germany. So it's increasingly looking as if the talk about vast arms supplies to Ukraine, that it's all dribbling slowly to a halt. And I suspect the fundamental reasons for this are logistic. There simply isn't that much equipment around. I gather, by the way, as I discussed yesterday, that Britain, the United States, have sent so many of their anti-tank and anti-tank missiles and man-pad missiles to Ukraine that their own stocks now have become dangerously depleted, and that they simply don't have enough to spare. So it's just quite an interesting revelation. It shows, it seems to me, that despite all the claims that we sometimes hear, US Army stocks and supplies of critical equipment are nowhere near as big as perhaps they need to be in a type of hot war situation. In the meantime, though, we have had some other really extraordinary statements, like one from Jake Sullivan, who essentially admitted that the Russians will never see the reserves of their central bank returned to them. In other words, the United States is going to seize those reserves and make whatever use it wishes of them. Quite an astonishing revelation. I mean, freezing is bad, but simply appropriating, stealing if you prefer, is obviously worse. One wonders what legal basis it will be justified. I expect none, but that's another matter. But anyway, there it is. But another major player is now increasingly hardening its position on Ukraine and on the issues of Ukraine and on its relations with the United States. And that country, that major player, is of course China. The first thing to say is that the Chinese have conducted, or are in the process of conducting, major drills around Taiwan. And the article in Global Times that covers these drills makes it quite clear who these drills are intended to warn. It's entitled PLA Drills. PLA stands for People's Liberation Army Drills around Taiwan, targeted at US lawmakers' visit. Rehearse real action once necessary. So it's making it absolutely clear that the forces that China has been engaging in, that are conducting these major exercises, are clearly intended to prepare for a possible assault on Taiwan, and in the event that the United States continues it's tiptoeing towards some kind of de facto recognition of Taiwan as some kind of independent country. Now, for time reasons, I'm only going to briefly read what this article says, but it starts: the Chinese People's Liberation Army Eastern Theatre Command on Friday organised multi-services and arms dispatching forces, including destroyers, frigates, bombers and fighters, and conducted joint combat alert patrols and drills, including maritime assault in the forefront of the East China Sea and in waters and aerial areas around the island of Taiwan, when a group of US lawmakers were visiting the island. Chinese mainland experts said the pointed military operation not only serves as a warning to US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who could still visit Taiwan after postponing her travel due to infection, but also goes beyond deterrence by preparing for potential real actions that would resolve the Taiwan question once and for all when necessary. So, couldn't be clearer. It's a warning to the United States. It's a warning to Taiwan or the authorities in Taiwan. And then we have a statement from Senior Colonel Shi Yi, spokesperson for the PLA Eastern Theatre Command, who said on Friday in a press release, "Those who play with fire will burn themselves. The command troops always maintain high alert and will firmly safeguard national sovereignty and security and regional peace and stability." And Senior Colonel Wu Qian, spokesperson of China's Ministry of National Defense, said in a press release on Friday that US congressmen visited the island of Taiwan in a deliberate provocation, disregarding China's strong opposition. The visit severely violated the One China principle and the regulations of the three joint communiques between China and the United States, seriously harmed the political foundation of China-US ties, and caused a further escalation of tensions in the Taiwan Straits. And China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian said clearly that Friday's military operation was targeted at the US congressional delegation's visit to Taiwan Islands. And there's particular references to the fact that veteran anti-China politicians like Bob Menendez, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Republican member of the Senate Budget Committee, Lindsey Graham, were the two notable members in the delegation. They met with the island's regional leader, Tsai Ing-wen, on Friday. And so it's quite clear that the Chinese are signalling their willingness to act and act decisively if these moves by the United States towards eventual recognition of Taiwan continue, and China's continued readiness to engage in military action if the situation further deteriorates. Now, this comes after a further strong Chinese response to statements by Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, who complained about China's implicit position over the situation in Ukraine. And we have a further article by Global Times, which says, "No way Yellen can scare China into changing stance on Ukraine issue." And it then goes on to say, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on Wednesday called on China to help end the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and she warned that China will face a loss of its standing in the world. And she's quoted by Global Times as saying the world's attitude towards China and its willingness to embrace further economic integration may well be affected by China's reaction to our call for resolute action on Russia. And then Global Times says This is a blatant threat to China, but China never accepts or becomes frightened by such threats. China's international status is achieved by its own strength rather than granted by the US. As Treasury Secretary, Yellen should know this better than anyone else. And Yellen's remarks are aimed at dragging China into the chaos and smearing China at the same time to create the impression that China is not a responsible power. Very strong response to Yellen's statements from China. The Chinese, again, refusing to be intimidated by the US into changing their position on Ukraine. And then last but not least, an editorial from Global Times: US reckless sanctions on Russia share blame for global inflation. And as the latest raft of inflation data from around the world clearly points to the fallout of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and Western economic sanctions against Russia, it is preposterous to see some Western media outlets continue blaming China for global supply chain problems and high prices. The latest example is an article from Voice of America, the propaganda arm of the US government, published in Chinese on Thursday, whose headline claims that China's lockdown has led to weaker demand for importers and higher prices in other countries. And then the Global Times editorial then goes on to say, it is true that the global economy is entering an era of high inflation at an accelerated pace. In the US, its Labor Department said on Tuesday the Consumer Price Index in March jumped 8.5% over the past year, the sharpest year-over-year increase since 1981. In Britain, inflation surged to 7% from 6.2% in February, the highest level in 3 decades, according to the Office for National Statistics. In the Eurozone, inflation surged to 7.5% in March, the highest level since the euro was created. In Russia, the annual rate of inflation accelerated to 17.49% during the week ending on April 8th, the highest since February 2002 and up from 16.7% a week earlier, the country's economic ministry said on Wednesday. By the way, the Russian figures, it may be interesting to say, show a deceleration of inflation increases there. The likelihood is we're going to see inflation in Russia start to fall sometime after the midsummer. But anyway, that's just in parenthesis. To return to the Global Times article, admittedly multiple factors contributed to the skyrocketing inflation around the world, and the COVID-19 pandemic being a major one. But there should also be no doubt that soaring prices of energy and a slew of bulk commodities is driven by the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the reckless US-led Western economic sanctions against Russia also exacerbated global inflation. Needless to say, it is too far-fetched to blame it on China's anti-epidemic measures. And then it goes on to say that despite the complexity and costs of the dynamic zero policy, COVID policy, China has proved to be one of the most resilient countries in supporting the global supply chains. China's supply chains have not been cut off due to the epidemic, which is demonstrated by the robust growth in its foreign trade. China's total imports and exports expanded 10.7% year on year in the first quarter of 2022. Against this backdrop, the US's recent eagerness to play up the impact of the zero COVID policy on China's and the global supply chain is actually a failed attempt to pass the buck and a sinister plot to hide their failure and surrender to the pandemic and the massive costs of their economic sanctions against Russia. At a time When global supply chains haven't fully recovered from the pandemic, the situation in Ukraine and the sanctions imposed on Russia have exacerbated disruptions to supply chains. With shortages seen in energy, raw materials and food supplies, countries around the world are bearing the brunt of Washington's geopolitical gambits. While US and Western officials claim that their economic and financial sanctions are aimed at punishing Russia, the truth is that these sanctions have also seriously harmed the interests of developing countries that are very vulnerable to high inflation when it comes to imports of food and other essentials. Many of these developing countries are also facing serious economic challenges. Western sanctions-induced price surges are rubbing salt into a wound. Inflation may mean price increases in developed countries, but in developing countries, high inflation can lead to food shortages and even trigger a widespread humanitarian crisis. There have already been growing warnings of developing countries in Asia and elsewhere facing serious energy and food shortages and economic crisis. Against such a dire picture, it is hoped that the West can refrain from finger-pointing and instead focus on serious efforts to address the growing list of economic troubles of serious global implications. As for the developing world, this calls for concerted effort to jointly preserve global free trade. Now, I'm going to add here that, of course, what this article doesn't say is that the finger that the US administration has been principally pointing as responsible for the worldwide inflation has been pointing not so much at China, but at Vladimir Putin and at Russia. And of course, this is now becoming the administration's theme, and it's becoming increasingly what President Biden himself is saying. We discussed this in a program, Alex Christoforou and I, on the Duran, where we agreed that this is having limited traction in the United States itself. The Chinese don't want to be seen defending Russia in this issue because, of course, their stance is preserving neutrality. But what they're basically saying is that it's not China that's responsible for causing global inflation. That is absurd. It is not Russia that is causing global inflation either. It is the United States and its allies. First, through their reckless policy of money emission last year, and now by their even more reckless policy of waging an economic war of attrition against Russia, the world's biggest commodity producer, which is, of course, creating massive problems across the supply chains. Chinese are obviously absolutely right, but unfortunately, I get no sense that anybody in Washington or Brussels or London or even Berlin is listening. Now, these is, as I said, a whole succession of very strong statements from the Chinese. The most important, undoubtedly, is the one over Taiwan. I think that the Chinese have increasingly concluded from what they see about US policy that the US is now gearing up to launch some kind of comparable economic war against them as the one that it is currently waging against Russia. And I think that they expect the same kind of provocations with respect to Taiwan as the Russians have had to endure beyond endurance, if you wish, in Ukraine. So I'm afraid I am hastening up my assumptions about a war over Taiwan. I thought that the Russians would wait longer before they launched the conflict in Ukraine. I thought they'd wait some time until their own supply chains to the Far Eastern countries had been fully developed, but they felt clearly that they had no choice but to move more quickly. And I get the sense that the Chinese are busy making the same calculations. It seems to me that someone in Washington is intent on provoking everybody. They're provoking the Chinese. They've provoked already the Russians. They're starting increasingly to provoke India too, which is a country that's also being threatened with sanctions. India, by the way, has now said that it's buying more S-400 missiles from Russia, and it's looking to increase purchases of coal from Russia as well, India being at the moment short of coal. So India is apparently now also slowly coming into the sights, and all of this at a time when the US still has unresolved issues with Iran, where the Iranians are now making it fairly clear that they're coming to the view that the United States is losing interest, is increasingly showing signs of losing interest in reviving the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, even though the outlines of an agreement are already there. Well, I have to say, all of this reinforces a sense I have of an administration that is out of control, that is now busy striking out in all directions. And all I will say about that is that, of course, if Ukraine has been disruptive to the global economic and the global system, then a crisis over Taiwan in China is going to multiply that by orders of magnitude. We are, as we say, as the Chinese like to say, living in very interesting times, and all the indications are that they're soon going to become more interesting still.